I want to start tonight with a number, not a headline, not a political statement, a number that I think most people watching this have not seen in any mainstream coverage, and a number that changes the entire logic of this conflict: 81.33%. That is the percentage of Israel's pre war Arrow interceptor stockpile that has been consumed since February 28, 2026, according to an analysis released by the Royal United Services Institute for Defense and Security, one of the most respected defense think tanks in the world. Let me tell you what that number is not. It is not a battlefield defeat. It is not a failure of technology. It is not evidence that Israel's engineers built the wrong system. It is the moment a mathematical constraint becomes an operational one. And once a defense system crosses that threshold, once the inventory curve intersects the missile curve, the entire logic of deterrence begins to invert. The country that was supposed to be protected starts making different calculations, rationing decisions, triage decisions, decisions about which neighborhoods get full coverage and which ones absorb the hit. That is what is happening right now. And tonight I want to walk you through exactly how Iran engineered this outcome, why the architecture of Israel's air defense, arguably the most sophisticated layered shield ever deployed in the history of warfare, is being methodically dismantled not by a superior technology, but by a superior economic equation, and why the ceasefire announced on April 8th, the one that both Washington and Tehran declared a breakthrough, has not stopped any of this. This is what nobody in the mainstream conversation is explaining clearly. Subscribe now if you want analysis that goes beneath the briefings. Let me establish the baseline, because the geography and the math together are the foundation of everything I'm about to show you. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes against Iran, targeting military infrastructure, nuclear sites, and senior leadership. Iran's supreme leader Khamenei was killed. The response came within hours. Iran codenamed its counterattack Operation True Promise I-4. What followed was not a single salvo. It was not a dramatic one-night barrage. It was something far more methodical, far more expensive to defend against, and far more precisely designed to exploit the single weakness that Israel's defense architects had never been able to solve. By the end of day 1, 90 Iranian ballistic missiles had crossed into Israeli airspace. By day 2, 65. By day 4, 20. Most Western analysts looked at that declining curve and concluded that Iran was running out of missiles, that the attrition campaign was working. That conclusion was wrong. And the Israeli military's own intelligence assessments began saying so quietly within the first 2 weeks of the conflict. What Iran was actually doing was shifting, not running out, shifting. Here's what changed, and this is announcement number 1. The missiles themselves got heavier, the warheads changed. By the 10th day of the war, Israel's Home Front Command confirmed that 50% of Iranian ballistic missiles arriving over Israeli territory contained cluster munitions, not conventional warheads. Cluster munitions, weapons that release dozens, sometimes hundreds of smaller submunitions across a radius of up to 10 kilometers before detonating. And here is why that matters operationally, not rhetorically. Israel's Arrow 3 interceptors, the top tier of the entire defense architecture, are designed to intercept ballistic missiles in the exo-atmospheric phase, above the Earth's atmosphere, before re-entry. The technical reason for that is straightforward. If you intercept a cluster munition after it has dispersed its submunitions inside the atmosphere, you have already lost. The submunitions are already falling. Interception at that point eliminates the delivery vehicle, but not the payload. The only intercept that matters against a cluster missile is the one that happens before the submunitions separate. This is what U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Jahara Matasek, co-author of the Rusi analysis, described when he said the bottleneck in this conflict is not money and it is not detection. His exact words: the bottleneck is industrial physics. You are firing a missile that costs between $2 and $4 million to intercept something that costs Iran a fraction of that, and you are firing that missile on a production line that does not scale like an iPhone factory. Each Arrow 3 interceptor takes months to manufacture. Each one costs between $2 and $4 million. Each Arrow 2 costs between $1.5 and $3 million. And each one of them, fired in defense, removes something from a stockpile that takes months to replace. Iran knows this. Iran has known this for years. The saturation strategy was not improvised. It was engineered specifically to exploit the asymmetry between the cost of offense and the cost of defense. And when RUSI published its analysis saying that 81% of Israel's Arrow stockpile had already been consumed, the implication was exact. At the pace of the conflict through late March, Israel's primary anti-ballistic missile capability would be completely expended before the end of April. That is not a projection. That is arithmetic. Received. That is announcement number 1. Now let me tell you what Israel's response to that arithmetic has been, because this is where the story gets structurally important. When you begin running out of your most expensive interceptors, you start making substitutions. You pull down a tier, you start using David's Sling, a system designed for medium-range threats, not for long-range Iranian ballistic missiles, to intercept things it was never optimized for. A former senior IDF official described this as a multi-layered interception policy. You want to hit the Iranian missile first with Arrow 3. If that fails, you fire Arrow 2, and then if that fails, David's Sling or THAAD. The problem is that each layer down carries a lower intercept probability. On April 5th, Iranian missiles struck near Dimona in southern Israel. Iran also struck Haifa. The interceptions attempted in both of those cases used David's Sling and not THAAD or Arrow 3. The Haifa missile was not intercepted at all. 4 members of the Gershovich family, Vladimir, 73, his wife Lena, 68, their son Dima, 42, and his daughter-in-law Lucille, 29, were killed when the warhead's kinetic impact collapsed multiple floors of their apartment building. The missile broke apart in the air. The Israeli Air Force confirmed that it was not intercepted because the projectile fragmented before the intercept window closed. This is not a story of a shield failing dramatically. It is a story of a shield being rationed, and rationing is the operational signature of a system reaching its constraint. The Wall Street Journal reported on March 27th that Israel had notified the United States it was running critically low on ballistic missile interceptors. The Defense Ministry responded 4 days later by announcing an emergency acceleration of Arrow production in partnership with Israel Aerospace Industries. The agreement, the ministry said, would enable a substantial increase in both the production rate and quantity of Arrow interceptors. What the statement did not say, and what every defense analyst reading it understood, is that even an accelerated production timeline for Arrow missiles is measured in months, not weeks. Months. The war has been running for 7 weeks. You cannot manufacture your way out of a 7-week deficit in the same 7 weeks, which means there is a window, its exact width classified, its existence confirmed by multiple independent defense analyses, during which Israel's top-tier ballistic missile defense is functionally depleted. Subscribe if this is the level of structural analysis you are looking for. This is what the Daily Brief exists to provide. Now, the United States has been filling part of this gap with THAAD systems. The Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, American-built, positioned in multiple locations across the theater. The Payne Institute at the Colorado School of Mines estimated that the war had consumed approximately 1/3 of America's total THAAD interceptor stockpile by early April. Each THAAD interceptor cost $12.7 million. The annual production rate for THAAD interceptors does not exceed 100 units per year globally. You do not rebuild 1/3 of that stockpile in months. You do not rebuild it in a year. Here's the cost exchange that no American network is presenting clearly. Iran fires a ballistic missile. The missile costs Iran, depending on type, somewhere between $200,000 and $2 million. Israel and the United States fire 1 or more interceptors to stop it. Each interceptor costs between $1.5 million and $12.7 million. The math of that exchange, sustained over 7 weeks across more than 500 ballistic missiles and 1,500 total strike events confirmed by ACLED, produces a deficit that is not recoverable at current production rates on the timescale of this conflict. That is the economic constraint that Iran designed, and it is working precisely as designed. Received. That is announcement number 2. Now let me tell you about what is happening right now this week with the ceasefire. Because this is where the situation becomes genuinely unstable in ways that most of the analysis you are seeing has not connected. On April 8, 2026, the United States and Iran announced a 2-week ceasefire brokered by Pakistan. Within hours of that announcement, Iranian missiles and drones were still being tracked across Gulf state airspace. The UAE activated air defenses. Saudi Arabia's civil defense issued nationwide alerts. Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar all reported incoming threats requiring interception. The ceasefire was announced, and the missiles kept flying. By April 9th, the Strait of Hormuz had still not reopened. Trump himself stated at an April 8th press conference that Iran must open the strait completely and immediately. The Iranian position was that reopening the strait was contingent on verified cessation of U.S. and Israeli strikes, including in Lebanon, which Trump had explicitly excluded from the ceasefire agreement. You cannot design a more structurally fragile arrangement than this one. The ceasefire rests on 2 conditions that both sides define differently. Iran says Lebanon is part of any comprehensive pause. Trump says Lebanon is not in the deal. The strait remains effectively closed. On April 9th, reporting from Pakistan confirmed that Iran had lost precise track of mines it had deployed in the Hormuz shipping lanes, making it operationally unable to guarantee safe passage even if it wanted to. Read that again. Iran lost track of mines it planted in the strait. Ships cannot transit a waterway where mines exist at unknown coordinates. The uncertainty alone closes it regardless of any political agreement signed in Islamabad. Vice President J.D. Vance, joined by Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, arrived arrived in Islamabad on April 11th for face-to-face talks with Iranian officials. These are the most direct U.S.-Iran diplomatic engagements since 1979. What they are negotiating is not a peace deal. They are negotiating the conditions under which both sides agree to stop making the current situation worse, while neither side concedes anything of structural significance. Iran's foreign minister is at the table. Iran's parliament speaker is at the table. Iran's former Revolutionary Guard commanders are at the table. The institutional weight of that delegation, compared to the American side, reveals something precise about each party's strategic position. And here is what the ceasefire does not resolve, and this is the third announcement. Iran still has interceptor ratio leverage, and it is not done using it. U.S. intelligence assessments reported by CNN on April 9th, one day after the ceasefire was declared, confirmed that approximately half of Iran's missile launchers remain operational despite 5 weeks of strikes by the combined U.S. and Israeli air campaign. General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, stated on April 8th that 80% of Iran's missile facilities were, in his words, gone. That leaves 20%. And that 20%, combined with the mobile launchers that have survived, combined with the decoy program that American intelligence confirmed Iran deployed to confuse targeting, means that Iran retains a functional ballistic missile capability that does not disappear because a ceasefire was declared. The Tel Aviv University Institute for National Security Studies estimated that Iran had between 2,000 and 2,500 ballistic missiles capable of reaching Israel before the war started. Approximately 380 of those had reached Israel as of early April. Even accounting for destroyed launchers and degraded stockpiles, Iran entered the Islamabad talks with a residual missile force, a drone fleet that CNN described as still capable of, quote, wreaking absolute havoc, and a mine threat in the strait that its own operators cannot fully map. The country that is supposedly winning the air war cannot close the strait, cannot restore commercial shipping, cannot bring oil prices back to their pre-conflict baseline, cannot rebuild its interceptor inventory on a timeline that covers the remaining negotiation window. And it cannot guarantee that the ceasefire holds through April 22nd, the date on which the 2-week window expires. If this analysis is landing differently than what you have heard elsewhere, share it with the people in your network trying to understand what is actually happening. That is why I do this. Now, here's what this means for you specifically. Because there is a direct line from the arithmetic I just described to something you have already felt. The Strait of Hormuz carries, in normal times, approximately 20 million barrels of crude oil per day. That is roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil supply transiting a single choke point. When that traffic collapses, as it has since February 28th, the effects do not stay in the Persian Gulf. They move through every supply chain connected to the energy system, which is every supply chain. By March, the U.S. Consumer Price Index showed inflation spiking to 3.3%, driven almost entirely by energy costs. The largest monthly gasoline price increase in 60 years, 21.2% in March alone, recorded by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. In parts of the United States, pump prices exceeded $7 per gallon. That is not an abstraction about geopolitics. That is a specific number attached to a specific moment at a gas station near you. Every day that the strait remains closed, every day that commercial insurers classify Hormuz transit as non-viable, every day that the ceasefire fails to produce the operational agreement to reopen those lanes, that cost compounds. It does not pause because diplomats are meeting in Islamabad. The economic pressure on American households does not take a 2-week break because a fragile truce was announced. The interceptor shortage, the saturation tactics, the minefields, the fragile ceasefire, they are not 4 separate stories, they are one story, and they all end at the same place, at the pump, on the heating bill, in the freight cost embedded in almost everything you buy. Now let me give you my assessment of where this goes from here, because there are 3 paths forward and they do not all look the same. The first path is the framework deal. Both sides agree to a broad outline of a comprehensive settlement in Islamabad. Iran suspends but does not abandon its missile program. The strait reopens on a verified schedule. Sanctions relief is structured in phases. Oil prices stabilize somewhere between $80 and $100 per barrel. Trump can call it a victory. Iran can call it a survival. Neither side has surrendered anything of ultimate strategic value. This is the most likely short-term outcome. It is also the most fragile. It contains contradictions that will not survive contact with the next crisis. The ceasefire announced April 8th was supposed to be this deal. It collapsed in hours. The second path is the breakdown. The April 22nd deadline arrives with no comprehensive framework. Iran's parliament, which has been publicly demanding $120 billion in frozen assets as a precondition to any agreement, refuses to ratify whatever Vance and Witkoff produce in Islamabad. The Hormuz Strait remains closed. The US faces a choice: resume the air campaign at a scale that produces genuine military decision, or accept a condition where the most strategically important waterway on Earth operates at Iranian discretion. Neither option is clean, neither option is free. The third path is the one I think deserves the most attention: the muddled continuation. The ceasefire holds formally. The Islamabad talks produce a joint statement full of language that both sides interpret differently. The strait partially reopens for some categories of shipping while remaining operationally closed to others. Oil prices stabilize at 60 to 70% above their pre-conflict baseline, and Iran continues to reconstitute its missile infrastructure quietly while both sides claim the diplomatic process is working. In that third scenario, the interceptor gap does not close. Israel accelerates aero production, but cannot fill the deficit created by 7 weeks of high-intensity conflict for many months. The cost exchange ratio that Iran designed, cheap offense against expensive defense, continues operating as a structural advantage even during the pause. And the next crisis, whenever it arrives, begins from a different baseline than the one that existed on February 27th. A country that enters a conflict with 81% of its primary missile defense stockpile intact does not exit that conflict with the same deterrent posture it had before. That is not pessimism. That is inventory mathematics. I will leave you with the questions that I think this situation is actually forcing, because these are the ones that determine what the next phase looks like, regardless of what gets signed in Islamabad. Can the United States accept a strategic environment in which the Strait of Hormuz is no longer guaranteed open by American naval presence? In which Iran's deterrent capability, a combination of ballistic missiles, drones, asymmetric naval warfare, and minefields, continues to function as a constraint on American freedom of action in the Gulf, even after the most intensive U.S. air campaign in decades has been conducted against it? And can that acceptance be structured in a way that does not signal to every other regional power, Riyadh, Ankara, Abu Dhabi, every actor watching from outside the theater, that American deterrence in the Gulf is now conditional rather than absolute? Because that is what the interceptor arithmetic, the ceasefire violations, the mines that Iran itself cannot fully locate, and the talks happening right now in Islamabad are all pointing toward. Not a conclusion, a new baseline. And somewhere in the strait tonight, commercial ships are still anchored outside the lanes, waiting for an insurance assessment that no underwriter is willing to provide while the arithmetic remains what it is. The captains who know these waters better than any analyst are looking at the same numbers I just walked you through, and they are all making the same decision. Wait. Tell me in the comments what you think comes out of Islamabad. Tell me if you think the interceptor depletion changes the negotiating dynamic. Tell me if you are already feeling this in your energy bills, because I read every single one. We will track every development: the diplomatic calendar, the missile counts, the interceptor production timelines, the strait status, every single day. That is what this channel does. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and we will see you in the next one.